Environmental degradation is the other side of industrial development for one of the oldest cities along the East Coast. But it was what enabled the city to flourish at its heyday. There probably were few laws, and even the laws that existed did not control how things were done. Probably not unlike what's happened in the city now, the desire to promote economic development, and in those cases, industrial development, meant that a lot of things were looked at and said, well, this is for the sake of jobs and whatever. So it is the downside, it's the backside, it's the underside of the industrial processes in Newark that developed beginning in the early 19th century.
But growing up here, I saw a lot of industry down here. I grew up next to a place called Conmar Zippers. For many years, they manufactured zippers. They went out of business from foreign competition. What happened is that for years the building just lay vacant. They were putting chemicals into the building, reprocessing chemicals, which was a legitimate business. The problem is that the business was they were violating all the safety, health, fire regulations. The building was in a serious damaged state, and they had a fire there. And it took the community action, really, to get that building eventually cleaned. The building had some really bad chemicals that, as I say, a technician once told me that if it exploded, it would have taken like 6 city blocks and left an environmental chemical fume there that would last probably 6 months or something.
Let me just begin where Ironbound Community Corporation got involved in the whole issue of environmental justice, and to kind of put it in context. Because the reality is although brownfields were there in the neighborhood, there really wasn't that consciousness around brownfields, what it meant, until the environmental movement of really the 70s. The Ironbound Community Corporation first got involved. We had a storefront on Fleming Avenue back in about 78, 79. I was working there at the storefront at the time. We had a gentleman coming in, an older gentleman coming in crying because the noise from the airplanes. This was when you had the Concorde coming in, and it was supposed to be going to Kennedy, but in times when it couldn't go in, it could come into Newark. So seeing a grown man crying about what it was doing to him and his quality of life got us involved in just that whole generic environmental issue. And so we went from the fight around trying to get planes rerouted to then starting to address brownfields. So a brownfield really is a fancy way of talking about a piece of land that's been poisoned. In the early 80s, when we found out, when the city put together a list of what it was called its Dirty Dozen. So these were its most polluted sites in the city of Newark. Out of that Dirty Dozen, 10 of them were in our neighborhood.
There are probably more abandoned brownfield sites in the Ironbound than any other section of the city. Tidewater baling. That was an example of what happened in many, many sites where a business shut down and left. If you went on that property just before the cleanup began, it was as if 3 guys were sitting around at midnight and said, okay, tonight's the night. There were containers with materials in it. There were balings, which are the steel things. And they just left. And nobody did anything about it. It wasn't even fenced in. Well, it certainly contributes to a sense of blight, that the community is a blighted neighborhood. It's not a alive, vibrant kind of a neighborhood. In the case of, again, looking at some of our more prominent, the Ballantine and the Tidewater Bailing, it divided the community. Geographically, it divided them, and economically. The area below, further east of those properties, was less developed and was poor. The idea in urban areas particularly is to look around and see, where is there land? How can it be put back in the service of something productive, and what's required? And that's what's led to the interest in Brownfields development.
Community Corporation has been focused on revitalizing the East Ferry Street neighborhood for nearly a decade, starting with the completion of the East Ferry Street Neighborhood Improvement Plan in 2004, which built upon ICC's history of neighborhood planning. One of the core elements of the East Ferry Street Plan was to figure out a strategy to redevelop what we called the superblock, a mass of underutilized land that contains the site of the former Ballantine Brewery and several brownfield sites. This super block isolates the East Ferry Street neighborhood from the rest of the Ironbound and leaves it neglected and underserved. The Ballantine had once been the major generator of jobs for the neighborhood, and when it left, outcomes for the neighborhood declined, leaving behind an average per capita income of under $8,200.
Sure, the Brownfields area-wide planning program is designed to provide tools for local communities to what I call looking beyond the fence lines. Look at a brownfield site in the context of the entire neighborhood, and looking at the surrounding infrastructure, identifying a community vision through engaging local communities, and really identify a strategy that uses the brownfield site to revitalize the entire community. The intention of the area-wide planning grant is to have communities identify for themselves the reuse of properties to serve their neighborhoods. In some communities, what they've identified is a need for recreational opportunities, in some cases urban agriculture, as a key aspect of revitalizing the neighborhood. So, what we believe is that this area-wide planning grant is a tool for communities to decide for themselves.
States Environmental Protection Agency announced their area-wide planning pilot, it was a perfect way for us to continue our neighborhood planning that is key for the revitalization of East Ferry. Our Brownfields area-wide plan is focused on several sites: an inactive Conrail freight line, the SDA property, which was initially part of Conrail's rail yard and was scheduled to be part of the new neighborhood high school. Another site was the Tidewater Bailing site, which is a former steel bailing facility that had been vacant for decades. Also in the planning area is Ironbound Stadium, known as Field A, which has been closed for over 25 years since contamination was discovered on site from its former use as a chemical plant. Lastly, there are 3 underutilized industrial sites in the area that are perfect sites for attracting green jobs, much like at the Ballantine.
A critical aspect of the success of the area-wide planning grants is local partnerships, and in particular, strong local partnerships between local government, local not-for-profit organizations, establishing a common vision. I mean, it is that common shared vision that is a predicate on the successful implementation of the area-wide plans.
part of neighborhood planning is actually finding groups, but then also residents and merchants and actually stakeholders in that neighborhood that live, work there, care about the neighborhood and are there, and figuring out how to empower them to actually take part in the implementation of a plan to improve the neighborhood.
So Iron Mountain Community Corporation brought people into a room together where people were able to sit at a table, look at a map, and discuss what we would like to see for those properties, what would enhance the quality of life for our neighborhood.
At the end of this process, 3 key themes emerged: more greening and more growing, more recreation space, and more goods and services. As such, the vision for the sites in our area-wide plan reflected these themes. The SDA property is slated to be a public market space with additional room for community gardening and urban agriculture. The inactive Conrail line is slated to be a passive recreation greenway through a Rails to Trails project. Field A will be restored as Ironbound Stadium with a multi-purpose football, soccer, and lacrosse field that will be utilized by the neighborhood high school and the community at large. Tidewater will also be reimagined and redeveloped as recreation with a combination of basketball courts, volleyball courts, tennis courts, and playground space.
I think this is something that the community is going to look positively on. You know, I think people definitely will.
Well, I think ICC's really done a good job with this. It's really easy to partner with people like that that are solution-oriented and cautiously optimistic and ready to have those conversations.
It's a place where people can come together and enjoy life. And it's very exciting to be able to dream, to be able to say, okay, here's what we'd like to see for our neighborhood.